Hello, welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Larry Liu, and today I'm joined again by Nicky Liu, my brother. He's currently living in Vienna, and so what's going on the other side of the Atlantic?
What do you want to hear? Nothing's going on the other side of the Atlantic. What do you want to hear?
Well, I mean, whatever events are happening in personal life or in the political sphere. The latest thing I've heard was that they were debating another lockdown due to COVID in several states in Austria, right?
Yeah, we had it coming. I mean, you could have seen it from far, far away. But it's a different kind of different from the previous lockdowns. They intend to only lock down people that are not immunized, that did not get the vaccine shot.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the latest debate that they're having is they want people to take the third booster shot, and which would be useful in terms of lowering the case counts. But I mean, there's going to be an issue of like what's going to be the uptake of the booster shot. Is it going to be enough to blunt the next wave? Perhaps not. And then the other concern is that isn't it the case that eventually everybody has to be exposed to the virus in order to bring the pandemic to an end?
There were several strategies, right? There was the zero COVID strategy that most Asian countries pursued, but because the rest of the world did not want to follow their lead. Yeah, it's a good strategy then. What do you call it in English? Herd immunization.
The herd immunity, yeah.
Herd immunity.
Herd immunity, yeah. So the original calculation was, I think, back in April and May and so forth, when the vaccination was ramping up, they said the pandemic is basically over once you have your second shot, or if you had the single dose Johnson. And it turns out, I mean, just like with the flu vaccine, where at the beginning when you get the dose, you have very heightened levels of antibodies, and but over time, I would say within a period of perhaps 6 months or so, you're going to have a substantial decline in the levels of antibodies. I mean, if you do get the virus, I think it still protects you against severe cases, severe disease, which is the reason why the vaccination is important. But it seems to be insufficient to bring the pandemic to an end. For that, perhaps eventual exposure, but with the vaccine beforehand taken, that's probably I hope that's going to be the exit path. Unless of course there's going to be a mutation that's going to be so bad that that won't be enough. But yeah, I'm very worried that
this plan still requires that everyone gets a shot. The problem is that there are more and more people that are reluctant, or better yet, people that are reluctant are you can see them now. They're vocal about that, and they are the ones responsible for perpetuating the situation. And it's practically impossible to convince them otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I've recently looked at the COVID case numbers in Portugal versus in Austria, Germany, and I mean the vaccination rate in Portugal is extremely high. I mean, it's like 86%, considering the fact that if children are, let's say, below the age of 12, might be 12, 13% or so. So it's almost a universal vaccination among the adult population in Portugal, and their case numbers are extremely low. I mean, it's going up a little bit now. I mean, Delta is affecting everybody, but it's nothing compared to what we see in the Austrian and German case. So what's the ideological frame of mind you would say in the Central European countries, which is anti-vaccine?
I mean, the problem is you can't force anyone to get the vaccine. That's a problem. That's why, well, let's say more autocratic states might be more successful in that. But if you take a look at what's that, Belarus, it's a more autocratic state, or Russia, semi-autocratic, but they still have problems with getting people vaccinated.
Yeah, well, the Russian case is very strange because I recall Sputnik 5 is the name of the Russian vaccine, and it was the first that got use authorization in the world with all of the COVID vaccines. But the uptake of the vaccine was somewhere like 10%, 15% or so of the population in Russia. And it has to do with the skepticism of the Russian people, which is to say they don't have confidence that the Russian government is going to provide good vaccine to the people. And I don't know what the end game is. I mean, are they waiting to import some vaccine from the West? I mean, or they're essentially hoping that it naturally goes away, natural infection, which of course overwhelms the hospitals. So it's a somewhat of a strange situation. There's another country. I mean, so in China and also in places like New Zealand and Australia, they have pursued a zero COVID strategy. And I would say, I think early on in the pandemic, I was like, yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. You try to suppress the virus, and the end result is very low rates of infection, very low rates of death. But then the issue is that there's no return to normal, right? It's like whenever you have just a few cases, then all of a sudden they have to lock down the entire city. And I think in Australia and New Zealand, I think they're starting to open up a little bit. But in China, there's no sign of that. And in fact, I mean, I know people who, let's say, they study here from China, and they wouldn't want to go back in the summertime because they would have to fly back via Shanghai, which is 2 weeks of quarantine. And after they finish that quarantine, then they're allowed to go back to their hometown from Shanghai. But then in their hometown, there's another week of quarantine, apparently. So there's 3 weeks of quarantine before they join the the rest of the population. And yeah, see, so right. I mean, is that the right choice? I mean, you could always say, yeah, it's the right choice because you're always saving people. But then at the same time, I think there's an issue with constantly being locked down, right? And not having returning to more normal form of existence, you could say.
Yeah, but that's because this. oh, I think this strategy is the best solution, but the problem is people are not consequent enough. They're not strict enough. It's like wishy-washy, the implementation. That's why every now and then people slip. Some cases slip past, and this perpetuates the situation. If they somehow manage to just lock down for like a month or so, a strict lockdown, a hardcore lockdown like China did, then the situation would have been over.
Yeah, but it's not just one lockdown, right? I mean, basically, what we're having is that whenever there's even a small flare up of cases, and the way how it happens is that cases get imported back into the country. I mean, if you have a few people who, despite getting tested, I mean, but let's say they still escape back into the population and starts infecting some people, becomes a super spreader or something. Then you're going to have increases in cases, and then at that point, the government then cracks down again. They're shutting down the whole town, and I think that might be a little bit too much, because I mean, we have to, I don't know. I mean, my preference now, I mean, the longer this goes on, I mean, maybe in the first year, if you said, let's lock down, see how long we can hold it. And now you have the vaccine coming out. I mean, at this point, we're still, basically inching towards potential new lockdown, right? I don't know. I think there must be a way to sort of get out of the the cycle of suppression, essentially. I would say, yeah, universal immunization coupled with basically breakthrough infections, that will probably be the way out.
Right, but that still involves the cooperation of all the people, including the anti-vaxxers, and that's a problem.
Yeah, well, what happens with the anti-vaxxers is that, yeah, they would be the cause for running up the hospital beds and the intensive care units.
What you gonna do about that?
Well, I mean, I know actually people in well, at least one person in my circle who sort of belongs in that camp, and has been laid off because city government, it's in New York City, is making a vaccine mandate, and then the threat of punishment of the mandate is being fired, essentially, or being furloughed, which means it's like unpaid vacation, basically, right? Yeah, and now there's like a legal battle that's happening between the sort of anti-vax employees and the city government. And so my take on the vaccine mandate is that I think it's going to be very tough to enforce it. Even okay, so let's say you have 20% of our people are the recalcitrant, the non-vaccinated people. And out of that, okay, so if you said we're going to do the vaccine mandate, of those 20%, how many are going to get vaxxed? Well, maybe 10%, so half of them. So then you're down to the 10%, sort of the last holdouts. And the first issue is like, are we willing to say, those 10% of the people you're not allowed to eat anymore, because that's effectively what you're doing if you're excluding them from jobs. And then the second problem that we have is, like, let's say the high demand jobs during the pandemic is the healthcare sector. So we know, like, people in care work, nursing homes, nurses, doctors. We know that there's, a small recalcitrant population that's not willing to be vaccinated. Now, if you fire those people in the middle of a pandemic, I mean, these are people, like, I think they would be willing to be tested every day, COVID tested. It's like the 3G ruling. I think, yeah, the 3G, I think that's enforceable. But then if you fire, let's say, this 10% of people, who work, let's say, in the healthcare system in the middle of a pandemic, right, where basically the issue that we're having is, we have enough beds, we have enough ventilators, we probably even have enough medicine, right, whatever, monoclonal antibodies and things like that. But if we don't have the staff, if you're cutting, let's say, 10% of your staff, the recalcitrants who don't want to get vaccinated, I would think that this is going to create more shortages in the hehealthcare system.
Yeah, well, but I mean, especially for healthcare workers, it makes total sense that they should be mandated to get vaccinated, because they are potential. They can potentially spread the disease to patients. I mean, you can let them handle COVID patients exclusively, but I don't know. I think it makes sense for them to get vaccinated.
Right, that would be the 2G, with in the German sense. And I would say I would still think it would be. I mean, if you had a very strict testing regime in place, where it's you don't just do, let's say, once a week or twice a week, but if you do it, every day, essentially, every day they show up to work. I would think that the threat onto patients would be reduced, and so right, so I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, you see, every policy is always a trade-off, right? So you're gaining something and then you're losing something else, right? And I would say that we should have vaccine recommendations, and we should make it more annoying for people who are not vaccinated. And I mean, what does it mean to be annoying? I mean, well, I don't know. I mean, you could, I don't know, cancel bonuses, or you could, reduce holidays or whatever. I don't know. I mean, there must be something else that could be done where you could.
Discrimination, basically.
Yeah. I mean, but I mean, but then, notice. I mean, I'm very concerned about mass quitting. If you do, especially in high demand sectors. I mean, you don't want to have a lot of people quitting the jobs effectively, because they're not complying with the mandates. So I mean, yeah, this is a very difficult political question for people to figure out. So what else is going on in the world? I mean, so obviously we have the COP26 that's happening, and I believe that they're trying to wrap up, or they're trying to finish the conference proceedings. And well, do you have a take on whether this meeting has got any tangible consequences?
I have not paid attention to any of that. You have to fill me in on that.
Right. So COP26 stands for Conference of the Parties. It was put in place by the United Nations back in 1993, I want to say, or maybe 92. And every year they were sort of trying to meet, and they try to set new targets with respect to mitigation of climate change and reversing it. Now, what's very interesting is that the urgency of this problem has been going up in an exponential rate, because all of our trends in society is happening exponentially, right? So our GDP is growing exponentially. Our population its growth is slowing down, but still growing at a considerable rate. Our carbon emissions has been growing exponentially. I mean, we're at about 36 billion tons annually. And the temperature rise, is also starting to take the exponential form, 1.2 Celsius from, I would say, pre-industrial average. And so you remember in the first, conference of the parties, when they were discussing the Kyoto Protocol, right, 1997. And I don't know, you might have been too young back then, but and me as well. But I've been reading about it recently. And at that point, they were saying that the industrialized countries should reduce the carbon emissions below the 1990 level. Right, so 1990 was supposed to be the peak. So that was the 1997 target, right? And then the next big target was the Paris Climate Accord, where now they're saying we want to limit to 1.5 C Celsius rise. That's actually much more ambitious, because now you're not just saying we wanted to flatten out the CO2. Now we're saying we're basically having to get to net zero carbon emissions. And then the question is when. And the genuine answer is as soon as possible. I mean, if we could do it tomorrow, we definitely should, right? Now, obviously, nobody can do it by tomorrow. So now it's now the complicated thing, because in the Paris 2015, they used to say, we're going to meet again in 6 years, and we're going to propose specific solutions to reach 1.5 C. That's why, Paris was, I don't know, it was just a foretaste. I mean, everybody sort of signed it back then. It's like, oh yeah, of course I promised 1.5 C, and then everybody goes home and does the old thing basically. Now in Glasgow, it's much more serious, because now they've contractually set up to say, this is actually what we're going to be doing to reach 1.5 C. I mean, just to sign the document to say, I want 1.5 C, that's the easy thing, right? The actual task, the actual challenge to get, like, what do we have to do to get to 1.5 C? Everybody's trying to negotiate that. the biggest sticking point is basically developed and developing countries. So if you're a developing country, you are in a bind in multiple ways, right? So because first of all, you didn't contribute a lot to the carbon emissions historically. Yet the climate disasters tend to hit very hard in countries that are poor. Because you cannot just say, oh, we're just going to spend, 3% of a GDP to, restore the whatever houses and crops that were destroyed by a weather event. You just don't have the resources to do that. And then the other thing is that all of these countries, I mean, with dynamic populations, think of, Niger, which is like a fertility rate of a little bit more than 6 per woman. So, fast growing countries by population, and all of them, they're saying, hey, I want to live a Western standard of living. I want to have electricity, stable access, stable supply of it. And now then the issue is, okay, well, so you need energy, right? Okay, well, where are they going to get the energy from? Well, it turns out that coal projects still seem to be the cheapest way to generate large amounts of electricity. And now, if you wanted to reach the 1.5 C climate target, which is to say we only have 0.3 C to go in that direction, I would say that building any coal plant is a disaster. Okay, so now, of course, all the developing countries know that. So now developing countries are going to the rich countries, and in Europe, US, and Japan, and all these countries, and they're saying, okay, we're going to do green energy. We're only going to build solar panels. We're only going to build the windmills. But you have to give us the money to do that.
Yeah, sounds right.
And the rich countries, they're like, I would say 11 years ago, I think it was Copenhagen or something. It was the last big conference before Paris. The rich countries, they signed the pledge. They said, we're going to give $100 billion by the beginning of the 2020s for, climate resiliency measures in developing countries. And now, obviously, we are in the early 2020s now, so they did do it. I mean, apparently they didn't. I mean, I don't know by how much they failed the target, but the rich countries have certainly not prioritized this form of development aid in the scale that would be needed to help the poor countries go through the energy transition and build up a viable energy infrastructure that's low carbon. So that's really bad news. Where we had a little bit of good news coming out of China, because they said, I believe last month, that that they were not going to finance coal plants in other countries. So that was the good news. Now the bad news was that that they were opening up over 40 coal plants, in China itself, right? Because under the Chinese energy plan, what they were saying was that they wanted to peak the carbon emissions at 2030. Now, the implication of that pledge is that within the next 9 years, we get to do whatever the hell we want. And so that doesn't sound like good news. Now, I mean, yeah, I looked it up recently. 62% of the energy sources in China is still coal plants. Now, the good news is also coming out of China, which is that they're number one in solar panels. And with wind energy, they're also very close to the top. Maybe they are at the top. But then also in terms of carbon emissions, they're also number one, right? Now it's even way more emissions than the United States, which was historically number one. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the energy demand is so high that basically they have like an all of the above energy strategy. And they have to do it if they wanted to, grow their economy in the same way. And so there we are in this dilemma, right? Where, if the developing countries, so outside of China, like think of India or something like that, if they're looking enviously at China, which is to say, we want to develop in the same way that they have, but using the same energy mix as China has over the last 30, 40 years, then we're in big trouble. I mean, it clearly is. I mean, that same sort of energy approach, it's the one that China's taken, and historically the Western countries have taken, is a path to quick disaster, essentially.
Yeah, but when it comes to India, there's still some way to go for them. They are not anywhere near the level of China. They are even near the level of industrialization like Vietnam.
Yeah. I mean,
they still have some severe demographic issues before they can get on the path of industrialization. I mean, they follow a different strategy in becoming an industrialized nation. Right? They've focused more on high-end industry, like software and electronics or something, rather than like China, basic goods, commodities.
So the Indian economy, the biggest sector, I think, is
telecom.
Well, it's actually still agriculture, I think, but it's moving towards the service sector. I mean, yeah, IT would be a big sector. I mean, telecommunications. Yeah, anywhere where you have some kind of call center, where there's a service that can be delivered to, Western consumers generally. I think India has that advantage. Now, is it going to be carbon intensive? Well, it's not going to be as carbon intensive as the Chinese way, which is manufacturing. But there's going to be growing energy demand too, especially if you have a growing middle class. I think that's the key, right? If you have more people that are hooked up to electricity, then you have air conditioning, and then you have travel, because that's also part of middle class membership. Then I would say the tendency is for the carbon footprint to increase, and so I think we have to point it out. I mean, we're facing a civilizational dilemma because, you know, if you tell people, hey, you know, actually to have a simple primitive lifestyle with minimum electricity is actually the best thing for the planet, for planetary sustainability. You know, if you said that, people would punch you in the face, right? Um, especially, I mean, if you're trying to take something away from people rather than, you know, giving them, you know, electricity and, you know, gadgets in the first place. So, okay, then we say, okay, well, we want to maintain our standard of living. And if you want to maintain the standard of living or grow it, you need more energy. And there's a contradiction right there in our system because the planet has fixed boundaries. You know, Jeff Bezos, the Amazon chief, you know, the boss of many of us. I sell books on this platform. Full disclosure here. And he was interviewed. So, okay, well, why do you want to go to outer space? You know, why do you have this Blue Origin project? If you heard of it, and he said that there's planetary limits to economic growth. He said that, you know, because if we're exponentiating energy consumption, which is a fair assumption because historically that's the path that we have taken, right? Then there will come a point where every piece of land on the global surface is going to be filled with solar panels. And it will still not be enough. And also, I mean, there's going to be issues like, you know, where do you source the material to build the solar panels, right? You're probably gonna do mining. You know, you're gonna pollute the groundwater, and you know, you're gonna destroy indigenous people's lives if they live in the mining area.
Oh, we're getting territory of science fiction here, where I got a little bit more to say than the topics before. When it comes to mining, there is always a distant future option of space mining asteroids, or mining different planets. Of course, different planets. It makes logistical sense wherever you mine stuff that you use it on site. So you can, however, like take an asteroid and somehow maneuver it back to Earth's orbit and mine it from there. That's certainly possible. And yeah, as you said, it's not like the Earth is the limit when you cover the entire surface of the Earth with solar panels. That's the end. You can still go to outer space and have satellites collecting energy. There is a project by I think the Chinese. I mean, the idea already existed to collect solar energy with satellites and beam it down to Earth as microwaves.
And so those microwaves, they would cross the air presumably there would be loss of energy, right? In that
The idea is to use microwaves to minimize the loss of energy because it doesn't react. It doesn't react with the atmosphere, and you still have to focus the energy with.
Is it? But it would have to go through the atmosphere, right?
Right.
Now, I mean, if I was walking on the street, could I be electrocuted as a result of these waves coming down?
That's what I'm wondering, but I've not looked very much into it. I just heard of the idea. I was wondering if a bird flies through the atmosphere where directly where the beam is, if it comes out as a grilled chicken on the other side.
Well, I would say that's very likely going to be the case, and so I mean, I was under the impression that
I'm sure it depends on the intensity of the wave. From what I've seen from the demo videos, it's a huge area where the receiving station is. So I guess the intensity of the microwave is not high enough to actually harm somebody. Kind of like sunlight. Direct sunlight is not very, very harmful to people, but if you collect it, if you focus it on a single point, it's the solar panels. So that's how you harvest solar energy.
Yeah, I would like to read more about it. I mean, to make a good judgment about it, because my impression was that electric current would have to go through lines like cables essentially.
I think you're mixing different concepts here. Yeah, there is a difference between currency and beams as a way to transport energy.
So okay, so you're saying there's two different ways how you could transport energy.
Plenty different ways to transport energy.
Well, so the grand promise that I've been reading about is fusion energy. But then which is the opposite of nuclear fission. And I've spoken with a physicist here, and I mean he's been very pessimistic actually, because I guess the idea is you have to be able to create magnetic fields, and within this magnetic field you should be able to produce the whatever the chemical reactions to that generates energy.
No, not chemical reaction. It's fusion. You need the magnetic field to keep the plasma. You're basically heating up gas, the plasma, to a very high temperature,
and that releases energy.
And that releases energy. Yeah, the heat is basically the energy. We're talking about heats what was that? I think 10 million Kelvin or something, and it's very hot. It's basically even hotter than the inside of the sun. So if that very hot plasma touches anything, it burns. It destroys anything. So you need the magnetic field to keep the plasma in place.
Right, but that's where the weakness is, presumably, because the physicists have struggled to keep up the magnetic field. I mean, it because it also takes input of energy, right? And to the extent that the input of energy is greater than the output of energy, right? It's not a viable technology, right? Because if you have a high input, well, guess where it comes from? It's in order to run the experiments, you're probably burning fossil fuel, right? You're still using the old technologies just to do the experimentation. And now, hopefully, with a lot of experimentation, they figure out a way to change that ratio of input versus output.
Yeah, and fusion energy is always a topic that you can read every now and then in the newspapers, at least my Google Feed news. The new breakthrough in fusion energy. If we're inching ever so close to commercial use, but yeah, I don't think we're anywhere near actual commercial use of fusion energy.
Right. That was also not the impression that I've had. So I think so I mean, so from a one scientist, I mean, I'm in the social science sector, but looking at the natural sciences, I would very strongly support funding more experiments with fusion energy, and we do have to get the smartest brains in the world in CERN or at MIT or wherever it is. We have to get them together, and we have to give them the money to run these experiments. But I mean, obviously, so if you analyze it from a policymaker perspective, I mean, you're always worried about, is that going to be enough to facilitate the energy transition? And I have a feeling that it's not enough. I mean, so there's some positive trends. I mean, if you look, for instance, at the costs of solar panels, so the cost of basically 1 kilojoule of electricity for solar panels, I mean, has been substantially decreasing. I mean, it was 20 years ago, it was very much uncompetitive with fossil fuels, which is always a benchmark. Now it is much more so. So that's really a positive thing. But one thing that we haven't figured out is, like, let's say if you have like a sunny location, and there you have a lot of solar panels, so you have this energy together. Well, first, the first problem is transporting the energy, right? So you actually have to have functioning grid lines, which a lot of rich countries are struggling even there because they're very old grid lines. So you're having to transport from where the energy is to where the people live, right? Which can be far distances. And then the second problem you're facing is that the sun is like, it's not always reliable, right? So you could have periods where there isn't enough energy collected, and then you have periods where there's too much of it. So then you actually have to invest in storage. You have to invest in batteries. But then the batteries themselves, I mean, it's very hard to produce it. I mean, the biggest reason why why we're struggling to create enough electric cars as well, because you couldn't get the batteries produced in time. You need lithium as mining again. It's a big part of it. So we haven't got like a real solution there. I mean, and then the other is the wind power. We say, oh, it's a great thing. I don't know whether you follow the headlines, but in the North Sea, so off the coast in Denmark and United Kingdom, this season the wind was terrible. There's apparently not enough wind. So all of the windmills that they've built is not producing the electricity that they needed for this winter season. So then, okay, well then, how are you gonna fill the gap? Well, natural gas.
How about the windmills? There's a different issue I've heard that offshore windmills collecting the energy from the atmosphere, from the winds, could slow down the winds so much that in the continent inland there's not enough. It basically sucks the wind dry from rain, and it doesn't rain inwards. So they could develop a drought inside inland. It could. I mean, it was just an observation from someone I've read somewhere, but there could be some. They could be onto something.
So there's drought that develops as a result of windmills?
Offshore windmills, yeah.
Offshore windmills. Because the windmills are pushing off the clouds. So, what's happening?
No, it's slowing down the winds from
down the winds.
Yeah.
And the wind is the one that's carrying the clouds, presumably.
Yeah, the moisture. I'm not really sure if this is true or not, but it could be a coincidence that the particular year was dry, or the due to climate change, it's getting generally more dry.
Well, actually, I think on average, climate change is leading to more moisture, but I guess there's probably the averaging across. I must assume what's happening on the ground is that there's some regions are getting drier and other regions are getting wetter.
Yeah, exactly.
So then you're gonna have, that's the intensity. I mean, I saw like one of the John Oliver episodes where I think he was talking about the dry west and then the moist east. No, it wasn't John Oliver. It was somebody else. It was Bill Maher, I think. So he was talking about like the dry west coast, like California and so forth, and the very wet east coast. So where I live now, and he says basically the solution is to build a pipeline. So you basically need a water pipeline that connects the east and the west. And so the way how the U.S. agriculture system works is that we basically get a big chunk of the produce, specifically like vegetables and fruits and things like that, from California. Presumably because California is a very sunny place. But then, but of course, that's only one input, right? I mean, the other input you need is the water. and the water output has been declining substantially because almost all the water that supplies the Southwest comes from the Colorado River. And the Colorado River is apparently at the lowest level in recorded history. So now there's a lot of farmers, basically the government comes up to them and says, we're going to cut your water by 25% because there's a shortage of water. And
Yeah,
so
I think that's okay if you cut the water if your groundwater is reduced, especially when it comes to farming. I recently watched a documentary from Arte about one of the mineral water producers, and Nestle, of course, who pump up the water, harvest the water from one place to sell us and sell bottled waters. I mean, I have issues with bottled water. I mean, I prefer tap. Bottled water is a waste of plastic. But they're still just pumping water for people to drink. Even though they said they sell it overseas or somewhere to sell to other countries, it's still sold to people who use this water to drink.
right, so you're saying the bottled water company is using the same spring water as the local.
They're extracting water from the springs from one particular place. Several particular places on Earth, and they are reducing the groundwater there. That's and this threatens the water quality and overall the water supply of the region. This is an issue, but again, it's for drinking water. That's what people need to live, right?
Yeah, but the question is whether it should be provided through bottled water, right? I think that's a big question.
If you have places where there is no water and people still, where are they supposed to get the water from?
Well, so okay, so if it's like if it's a place that has absolutely no water, then I would say Homo sapiens should not live in that particular location. I think just abandon that place. If it is, if you're relatively close to a location where you have, the water access, we should invest in infrastructure, right? I mean, we should, build wells. I mean, pipelines to connect to aquifers. I mean, but these are definitely questions that need to be raised. But I would say that, I mean, if you're really far away from any water supply, I think that maybe that's not a good place to live, right?
I mean, we're human. We're living everywhere in the world.
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, these are we're going to have distributional conflicts, and they're going to have to intensify, because what we call a nice patch to live, that nice patch is getting smaller and smaller. I mean, if you look at what's happening in, like, the situation in Belarus and in Poland, where basically, I mean, the Belarusian dictator, his name is Lukashenko, he has been facing sanctions from the European countries, from the European Union, for basically oppressing the opposition, right? Which I mean, but he's been doing it since he came to power, right? I mean, that's nothing new, right? Um, but this time, like the whatever civil rights movement over there has, gained much more momentum. They got a lot of European elites on their side. So now the European Union did the sanctions, right? And now what Lukashenko is doing is he is paying for refugees who, I mean, I don't know where they're from. I mean, I guess like Middle Eastern countries. Like it's probably going to be, Syria or Afghanistan, or one of the places where there's a lot of upheaval and a lot of people are being pushed out, paying money. So they move to like a hostel in Minsk in Belarus. I think they even fly them in. I mean, or yeah, they basically let them in. Pay the living expenses of the refugees for maybe 2 or 3 months, and then when that 3-month time period is over, they run out of money, and then the government says to them, "Hey, why don't you go to Poland?" And that's the refugee crisis on the Polish border, right?
Yeah.
And so what's the objective? So his objective, Lukashenko, is to convince the European Union to lift the sanctions against his regime. I mean, and I mean, he must have probably seen what has happened between Turkey and the EU. I mean, if you remember 5 years ago, magically the refugee flow stopped. The so-called Balkan route was shut. What did that mean? It basically means paying off Erdogan, the Turkish president. They were paying out like $6 billion, 6 billion euros. And then all of a sudden Turkey said, okay, we shut the borders, fine. And then the refugee crisis was over in Europe. And Lukashenko probably looked at that and he was like, yeah, that's maybe I can do something like that too. Using the refugees as pawn. Now, I mean, but the bigger point is that, like, whether it's the Belarus situation, the Turkey situation, Libya, which was also one of the big transit countries, Morocco, like we haven't seen anything yet, right? I think what we're seeing right now is the trickle of people that's coming up here, coming up to the Western countries, and it's going to be much more in the future. I don't see any future in like particular regions in the world. I mean, take for instance like Bangladesh, right? A place we should know somewhat well because of course we have family in West Bengal, which is it's very close to the Indian Ocean, and the southern half of the country is basically like a giant delta. It's like basically the water cuts through everywhere, and people are living very close to the water. Now, if the monsoons is getting heavier and heavier in that region, then people who are closer to the coastline are going to be displaced, and that's what happened to them. And the first thing they do is they go to the city, to Dhaka, to the capital, and then they live in these slums. And then I don't know what they do for a living, maybe prostitution for the women, construction jobs for the men, something like that. And I mean, I would be very surprised. I mean, if some of these people wouldn't get the idea to to go west, to quote the Pet Shop Boys song. I mean, it wouldn't have to be the majority of them, but even just some of them. I mean, yeah. So this is I think the refugee wave. I think that's going to become much more important as time goes on.
Yeah, I mean, such are we people. We have always been traveling around the world. And especially at the time where the climate changes.
Yeah, I mean, people are going to be
in history, what eventually led to the downfall of Rome, the so-called migration period, was also triggered by climate change.
Right, because it got really cold where the Germanic people used to live, essentially.
Yeah, and some people got dry. They couldn't keep up the food production, which also leads to catastrophe.
Yeah, I mean, this is so. There's an interesting thesis by a guy named Joseph Tainter. Jared Diamond, who's another guy who wrote about this, but it's about trying to explain societal collapse, which is always a very difficult endeavor. But yeah, you basically have to take historical case studies and then see what are the causes for the decline. And yeah, I would say, yeah, the climate events would probably be the major ones. Yeah, not being able to acquire the resources to sustain civilization, or even a minimal amount of whatever it takes to keep the human body alive. Now, I mean, the irony is, I mean, for us, this whole idea of like living like a hunter and gatherer, I think in the abstract, it does sound very romantic. But most of us would scarcely survive being, placed into the shoes of a hunter and gatherer. Yeah, it's there was a book by Michael Easter, and he was writing about what he called the comfort crisis. And the simple idea is that because we have not been exposed to physical danger and to working hard physically, right? We get to sit around in our temperature controlled rooms, as I do over here, and we always have safe access to food supplies, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the Easter's argument is that we're losing out, essentially. I mean, he said that there was something good about struggle, physical, mental, etc. And
are you subscribing to this his theory or his point of view?
My take on it, I support that viewpoint.
That means for people to have a raison d'être, they need to suffer.
Yeah, I strongly believe that you need to build some struggle into your daily existence. So I mean,
are you saying you're supporting the system of wage slavery?
no, I don't support that particular system. That's different. I mean, again, this goes back to this.
How do you
My take on
introduce
UBI and
into everyday modern man? How do you make him struggle?
right. So I mean, just in my own personal life, I mean,
Struggle for survival.
no, well, it's okay. I mean, so am I saying that people should become hunters and gatherers? Quit their job, go to the woods, sell their house? No, I'm not saying that. So even Michael Easter, I mean, going back to his argument, I mean, he has very modest demands. He says, why don't you go exercise every day, right? He's also a big supporter of rucking, which is the idea of like running with a backpack, just like in the Austrian army where we both served. If you have that body weight, that physical weight, no, I never do that, but I do engage in physical exercise. I very much like the idea of panting, which is being out of breath. I like the pain in the leg region, because it's in a sense like, I mean, so for me, the main benefit of physical exercise is not about reducing disease risk and being healthy and whatever else. I mean, that's a side effect. I mean, obviously, it's great to have that as a side effect. I mean, for me, the main benefit of physical exercise is the discipline of the mind. Because I mean, because the mind desires things that is easy, right? Like sleeping for long hours, or eating a lot of food, sitting down. Like those are the simple things, and I think that's a natural inclination. But you haven't actually trained your mind to be disciplined whatsoever. And I was like, I think in the if you're living with the privilege of the West civilization, I think physical exercise is one of the few assured ways in which you can enforce mental discipline. I mean, it's not the only one, obviously. I mean, you could think of other things. I mean, just doing things that are hard. Like, I don't know. I mean, for me, playing guitar would be really hard because I haven't done much of it. But sitting down and grinding at it. Yeah, grinding. I think that's a key term, right?
Oh, okay. I mean, it's good and all, self-discipline and getting some exercise to get more active. You feel healthier, etc., etc. I agree with all that. It's good and all, but that's only for. It's a very individualistic approach. What do you go about? What do you do with people that are, let's say, more comfortable in living, who do not possess this kind of mental exercise, mental manipulation to get to raise your self-discipline.
Right. So what do we do with those people? I mean, they.
Mind you, those are the majority of the people who do not wish to struggle.
Right. So, I mean, so one of the foundational thinkers in sociology, his name is Emile Durkheim, who's a French sociologist. And one of his big takeaways, so he talks about the importance of social norms. Basically, these are unwritten rules that govern society, essentially. And, of course, then every society has somewhat different norms. Okay, well, but but the important thing is also like he distinguished between the modern sort of individualistic society, and the old traditional societies, which are basically tribes. And so we live in nations, right, where there's like this abstract government out there, and it provides us with goods and services and stuff, and we pay taxes. But there's not really a lot of allegiance to the nation, um, versus like if we are part of a tribe, which is basically the immediate family, and then maybe some more people. The allegiance that we feel to that tribe is extremely strong, right? And and then if we don't follow the norms of the tribe, we get banished, and then we banish. There's a high chance of death, essentially. Um, Now, so the important thing is that so either we get the whole society to break down from the nation to the tribe, but that's very unlikely to happen, and I do not advocate for it, because it's much easier to survive in nation state than the tribe physically. Then the other solution is you create your tribe, within whatever polity that you live in, right? Um, so what does that mean? Well, it could mean like you going to church. That's one form of community. This is one form of tribe. Of course, you have to believe in the religious concepts and stuff like that. Okay, well, if you don't like that, then what about the sports club? You go meet, whatever, you play sports with, and um what about community activism? There's some cause that you strongly believe in, and you meet like-minded people, and then they start caring about you and things like that. Then through the social networks that you created, that's where the accountability comes in, right? Because I think there's a lot of people, they want to be part of this tribal network, and they want to have their ass kicked in order to work hard at something, right? And I mean, if you belong to my tribe, which is like the academic, the scholar type, the only discipline that we get is self-discipline. I mean, there's nothing else. I mean, because if you're not self-disciplined enough, it might be hard to survive as a scholar, because you're just not going to be writing any papers and stuff. And I can definitely see that this is not the most common, personality in society. I think the most common personality is the ones that need to obey, uh, the rules of the tribe. Yeah, I think that's what would have to happen. Yeah, you just join a tribe, and hopefully there's going to be some people in there who take on a leadership position, and those leaders are going to kick your ass essentially.
Peer pressure.
Yeah. I think that's a big piece of discipline externally provided.
Yeah, that's the only source of motivation for shallow-minded like me.
Yeah, I mean, and well, I mean, if you know how to diagnose this, then you can just go seek out, live out your cure, so to speak. I mean, it is. I think it is definitely one of the biggest questions about, how do I get myself motivated to do anything?
Yeah. Okay. Let's get back to society. The problem with nowadays society is that the people are getting more and more individualistic. They're shutting themselves. They are able to shut themselves away from the rest of the world. How do you motivate them to integrate into society?
So you were referring to people who are recluses.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the Japanese called hikikomoris. So these are individuals who
Not just them. They're very, very extreme case, but it starts earlier. The locking yourself away from any possibility of having that motivational peer pressure by just turning away any social interaction. But not every social interaction like hikikomori, but you can still go to work, go to school, or whatever. But afterwards, you're on your own.
And then what's the
you seek the path of the least resistance, and that's where you get to the you are not struggling anymore part, and your life loses meaning.
right? You're just doing just enough to fit the social norms externally, but not much more.
Mm-hmm.
I
mean, my question is, how do you give these lives meaning in a society? When we're saying the only meaning a human life can have is when they struggle.
Right. So we're back to the Schopenhauer point about the meaning of life is boredom or struggle. So there's only two states: boredom or struggle.
Like Nietzsche, every now and then like to quote Nietzsche.
Well, yeah, because Nietzsche was basically, Schopenhauer came a little bit before Nietzsche, and then Nietzsche was a admirer of Schopenhauer actually, because they're both cutting in the same existentialist camp. And so so in terms of like, is there like a global meaning, to your existence? No, I don't think there is. I mean, but so then the only thing I think you can do is to find local meaning, which is to say, for yourself, essentially.
Yes, but the shallow-minded one cannot find this by himself. He needs peer pressure.
Right. I mean, but I mean, I think in most cases, I mean, if there's some form of social integration, right, in any limited way, I think it's going to be enough for them. I mean, I don't know, like,
we just described the
throwing a
situation.
party or something. I don't know.
We
From time to time.
just described the situation where the recluse shut himself away from any social interaction.
Yeah, well, if he has done that, well, there's only two ways out, right? I mean, either that person has an inclination for self-preservation sufficient for them to overcome that situation by, you know, seeking out people or whatever. That's A, or B, there's somebody else that they know within, you know, maybe family or friends or whatever, that can, you know, help pull them out of that state. I think those are the only two ways out, essentially. If you have reached that, if you have reached the recluse stage.
There was once an anime I watched. I think I mentioned it on your last podcast as well. I might mention here again. It's Welcome to the NHK. It's about a anime show about an hikikomori, and he met another hikikomori, and the only thing that pulled both of them, they didn't have much to do with each other. But the only thing that pulled them out of the misery is hunger. In both cases, hunger.
Because so for hikikomori, so the parents passed away, I must assume, and with that the pensions and the money.
Yeah, the main protagonist got some form of income from his mother. His mother got laid off, so basically cut his pocket money. Now he has to hunger. So now he would either suffer hunger or go out and work. He chose he chose the first to hunger for a while, but then he couldn't sustain the hunger. He couldn't bear the hunger anymore, and went out work.
Yeah. So, but that would be my point of self-preservation, right? So
good. Okay. The point I'm trying to another point I like to discuss, and we are always circling back in every conversation of ours, what's called UBI. In a UBI world, well, where hunger is not a possibility for the hikikomori anymore. What now? What's the meaning of his life?
Well, so right, so you can interpret UBI in the most pessimistic form, right, which is the example that you delivered, and I will never deny that this is a possibility, right? That you're going to find cases where the most negative outcome, social outcome, is going to happen. But I wanted to paint a much more positive, you know, couple of examples where there's going to be, let's say, creative people. I mean, I mean, if you think about it, I mean, almost every human being, you know, has at some point been creative. That is to say, as kids. I mean, so like whenever you see any kids, and it's really remarkable, like, you know, how they take objects, you know, around them, you know, like a piece of carton or, you know, or a book, or, you know, some object, some toy object, and they play around with it, and they play with the other kids, and then they create these, you know, fantasy worlds, and they can basically spend the whole day doing it. And then so at some point, this kind of playfulness and curiosity and sense of discovery stops. and at that point they become, teenagers, adults, whatever, right? They become normal people. And I want to say that maybe being normal people is what we don't want. Maybe there's something about the childlike playfulness and curiosity that we should sustain into adulthood and even into old age. I mean, yeah, I mean, so somebody who, like, I don't know, like the most extreme examples, I mean, I think like musicians, right? Musicians who, like, when they were like 12 years old, they picked up the guitar or the drum or whatever. They started playing and they got hooked on it. And now, okay, most of them is just going to be garage band, and then, that's it. And then they go, do a bourgeois job. But for some of them, they keep at it, and then all of a sudden they make a career out of it. And even if they're like in the 60s and 70s, I mean, at that point, they're still composing music, right? I mean, or they're playing it, and because they, as kids, they were exploring the music, and as old people, they're still playing the music. And that's what we have to encourage more of. And I think that the UBI world is going to be the basis for it. I mean, it's never going to be a guarantee. I mean, I cannot guarantee that this is what's going to happen to every kid, but the basis, it's a threshold, right? The minimum, right? Not the maximum, not the floor, not the ceiling. That's what we want to create.
I completely disagree with that. I disagree with that. I don't think that a society of infantile-minded kids basically is a healthy society.
I think it's going to be a very healthy society. And I mean, and this comes from my own, ruminations, obviously, because
I mean, even nowadays you have to deal with people, actually our generation, the millennial generation, who partly never grew up. I mean, I count myself as one of them who didn't really grow up in a sense, in a traditional sense, but still child, can I say child-minded? The consequences, those people will not take responsibility for anything, or hesitant to take responsibility with, which is a mark of adulthood.
Yeah. Right. So so that's a sort of the anti-argument. I mean, you could say, well, we want to bring people into the adult world, and that is to say, we want them to struggle, we want them to go through, well, struggle in a strict sense, meaning wage work. And of course, the capitalist economy doesn't support wage work in the ways that for the millennial generation and younger, as they did for the baby boomers and before, right? Like, how do you measure it? Well, I mean, you just brought up a measurement, right? People who, fail to get a stable career, people who fail to get married, have children, buy a house. But also it's about, I mean, you can read it from other indicators too. I mean, like strict economic indicators, like GDP growth, which is less today than it was back then. Productivity growth, less today than it was back then. Well, what does it tell you? Well, it doesn't tell you anything about, all these millennials are stupid kids who are irresponsible. I think all it tells you is that the capitalist system does not deliver what it used to deliver for previous generations. And mind you, I would say that it should not. The capitalist system should not deliver what it did to previous generations. And I'm going to say why. It's because of climate change. I mean, we're back to this topic again. I mean, because when you say, well, I want to grow the economy, and growing the economy is the only way how I can supply, the millennials with middle-class jobs, right? But then this middle class, I mean, it's driven by consumerism, right? It means you have to take more vacations to faraway places, taking an airplane all the time. It means that you're going to have to drive, a big car, to a lot of places. And that's what we don't want. I mean, based on the climate disaster, that's what we don't want. So what we want is something very weird, right? On the one hand, we're like having to convince the millennials to be less materialistic, less seeing their form of identity realized in wage work. Yeah, these are less materialism on the one hand. And then on the other hand, yeah, it means ecological sustainability. And then we come to the third point, which is, well, what's the impact on meaning of life? So I don't have the universal answer for that, but I do know that UBI is going to provide us the floor to cut between these these two paths, of ecological sustainability on the one hand, and then enough economic security. I mean, you're not going to be wealthy with UBI ever, but you're going to have the basics of life guaranteed, essentially. So this is it's like a very narrow corridor in which we walk, in which Homo sapiens has a future. And I think it's our responsibility, sort of, as the members of the intellectual class, to bring this message to as many people as possible. And it's going to be a tough battle, but I don't know. I mean, we have good advocates nowadays. I mean, for UBI, the UBI movement. We have good advocates on the ecological front. I mean, the Greta Thunbergs of the world, and AOC in the US and stuff.
Can provide some kind of propaganda slogan now. I mean, that's how you fish for simple people, not with intellectual discussions, but with paroles, with propaganda.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's no universal statement here. I mean, I would just say, I mean, it's freedom, like you go back to this.
Okay.
Right. So because you remember the COVIDiots, and whatever the Querdenker is a German term. I mean, people who don't believe in the vaccine, which we have people here as well. And they're driven by a good value, right? So it's wrong views, but they're driven by a good value, which is freedom, essentially. Right? I mean, it's essentially the freedom to not get jabbed. Now, I mean, of course, again, it's a wrong view because you kill people along the way. But the value that's sort of underlying the belief is good. Because we want freedom, right? And the most convincing point that the UBI movement is making is to deliver freedom. We want more freedom for individuals, because right now it's like, so we have freedom in a formal bourgeois sense, right? You know, which is it's broadly, it's about freedom of speech, rule of law, democracy, and there's a few things that sort of fall in that camp. But you know, if you sort of in a Marxist line of thinking, I mean, you always say, well, in this one economic realm, you know, we're not being given the freedom, right? Okay, we have the freedom to practice a religion. You know, we have the freedom to say whatever we want without going to jail. You know, I did, you know, a couple of these things. And then, but do I have the freedom to do whatever I want in economic life? And the answer is no. Now, I mean, you could say, well, I mean, if the society is poor, you know, would I want everybody to work? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, if you live in an agricultural society, you know, the reason why we had high fertility rates, you know, every family should have 10 kids. Well, why is that? Well, because you need more hands to plant the crops, to grow the crops. Now it's like, you know, the incentive is to have fewer children because, you know, education is expensive. You know, raising a child is expensive in urban areas. But the idea is also that, you know, we have objectively less of a scarcity situation than at any point in human history. And then the question is, well, why are we placing people into scarcity potentially by basically giving them only access to, you know, low paid jobs, you know, one contract after another?
That's a construct of society. Economic philosophers of the past have always predicted by the beginning of the millennium that the grandchildren don't have to do work anymore. All the work is done by robots. But look at us today, 20 years into the millennium. Far from it. Still have to slave off for poor wages. And it's a societal construct to give people some purpose to struggle for the survival. Just have to work for work's sake. Most of my time I play video games. One of the games I play is called Stellaris, basically a science fiction game. And I was always wondering, but it's set like fictionally, like 200 years in the future, when you can basically play any alien society. But every society still has workers, laborers. I mean, you can build some robots, but it's different. Robots are basically population. But they still have to work, and if they don't work, they're unemployed. And if they're unemployed, they're causing problems.
But there's unemployment benefit, right? And welfare.
And said unemployment benefit, but it depends on what kind of society you want to create. If you want an autocratic society or a stratified society, of course you don't want your workers to live comfortably. But if you want a more utopian society, you give them so much benefit, but it costs it's going to put a dent on the economy, and that means less starships to defend off against alien empires. But at least your unemployed will produce a little bit of there's a monarch or unity or culture or something. They can produce a little bit of that and science a little bit of that. Yeah, otherwise they cause probably unemployed cause problems. They don't have a sense of a meaning, a meaningful life, a raison d'être. So, but all of science fiction predicts that every labor is will be performed by robots. So why do you still need people to be employed to till the fields? It doesn't make sense to me. But then thinking about it, it's a societal construct to give people purpose. You still employ people to give them purpose. Otherwise, they're gonna be stupid, do stupid things, like podcasts or some bullshit like that.
Yeah, well, so no, well, actually, that's a good plug. I mean, you said podcasts are just one example. I mean, you could do blogging. Yeah, you could play video games. I mean, basically the activities that you and I are doing, and we could do, a lot more of that. If it was officially subsidized by basic income. And then the argument, well, it's going to necessarily have to lead into social disaster. I mean, perhaps you and I might be the example of a society continuing to function quite well, even if we have a lot of members in the leisure society, because all that we're doing, I mean, if you're playing video games or you're doing podcasting, I mean, it is an expression of leisure society. I mean, if you and I were like, I don't know, bankers, CEOs, or neurosurgeons, I don't think we would have the time to to waste it. I mean, using the sort of the bourgeois norms here, so that to me is an example of like, hey, we might be the examples of this could be the future, and I think, and it should be subsidized at a societal level. Now, the argument about economic scarcity, again, it always goes back to this. If you said we're going to reserve 10% of the nation's GDP, which is not little, but about 10%, to fund the basic income. Now, I mean, I will accept the point of neoliberal thinkers that if the cost burden is much larger than that, then you're going to have problems with incentives and potentially scarcity and the economy declining and so on and so forth. But if we said, look, I mean, this is the minimum amount we're giving to people, 10% of a national income is more than enough to at least provide the bare essentials, which in every society usually means housing and food. And I think medical care, I think those three are the pillars of social security. I think a society like that could function extremely well.
I'm not so sure about that. But I mean, it's one scenario, but the issue is always the transition phase. How do you get from here to there? How do you implement that? How how do you keep people doing essential work and not just throwing the towel and basically enjoy early pension?
What, well, so first of all, you have to identify in every society what the labor shortage is, and the market regulates it extremely well, right? Meaning it would be reflected in the wage structure. So if, like, let's say if you have like a high demand, low supply job, right? What does that mean? Well, it means that those wages must be very high, because that's the only way how you can get people to work these jobs. And also notice that so the tax incentive structure is going to be actually more favorable towards work than the present system. Because in the present system, if you're, let's say, if you work a low wage job and the government starts to tax the welfare benefit that you used to receive when you were unemployed at, let's say, 50%, right? So for every dollar, for every euro that you're earning at your job, the government is going to cut 50 cents from your welfare benefits. So you're only getting the extra 50 cents on the work, essentially. That to me is like, yeah, that's a bigger disincentive structure than if you said, let's say, the first, I don't know, whatever the minimum threshold, 1,500, let's say, first 1,500 of labor earnings, you make it tax free. And then the amount above 1,500, that's when you start doing the tax back. Because I mean, at some point, somebody has to be the net taxpayer. I mean, in every system you have that, right? So so that would be the incentive structure, and then yeah, so to the tax system, I think is the UBI tax system, I think, is more favorable to workers who are, you know, in low wage jobs, who are at the sort of threshold of collecting welfare. That's the first point. The second point is, you know, the market wages would regulate, you know, would regulate. I mean, you're going to have high demand, low supply jobs. Like, I mean, I was a couple of days ago, I was reading about the trash collection crisis in Rome. And it seems to be a very common problem in Italy.
Southern Italy.
Yeah, in southern Italy, but now even in Rome, I mean, the capital city, weirdly, where so the mayor, Raji was her name. She was elected 5 years ago with a five-star movement, which was a big populist party. And recently she was, yeah, kicked out of office. You know, by, like, you know, the PD, the Partido Democratico, and yeah, because she couldn't fix the trash collection crisis. I mean, so there are a couple of problems. I mean, there's a labor issue, right? It's like, okay, well, you know, are you paying the trash collectors enough money to take out the trash? And then apparently the second problem that they have is they don't have incinerators. So then what do? Well, I mean, so they basically dump more and more trash in the landfill. Now, then the landfills are basically quelling over. and then they basically put the trash into these trucks and then drive them all across Italy. And then they throw them at, somewhere in the countryside. So in the countryside, they're also building up landfills. I mean, I think, a much better waste management would be if they have to build incinerators.
Yeah, build incinerators. Yeah, that's what I was saying. Because there is still a lot of energy to be harvested from waste.
Yeah, but they're not doing that. But anyways, but the waste management, yeah, I think that's one of these typical jobs. It's like it's essential for society, and you're not going to find a whole lot of volunteers. Who wants to smell like shit all day?
Well, in Austria, it's actually a pretty good, well-paid job.
Yeah, for a reason. It should be. It should be.
One of my old school friends did that. He worked for a couple of years as a trash man because of the money. He studied, but he actually worked as a trash man and then as a lumberjack for some reason. Because those are good paying jobs.
Yeah, that's right. So the market will reflect that. The market will take into account scarcities, and it should, So I wouldn't be overly concerned. Now, then there's people who say, well, if there's going to be inflation because, on the one hand, you were having to overpay the trash collectors, and then on the other hand, you're taxing him too much to fund the UBI. So there's going to be, an inflationary spiral. Is the argument. These are all empirical arguments. They have to be. We have to test it out in practice. If I would be the first one, like if UBI results in what we call inflation spirals, which basically means more than 2% inflation for extended periods of time. Then we should change the approach. The first thing you could do, if it was a UBI that caused it, which I don't think it will be, because as I said, it's about 10% of GDP. But if that was the cause, you could try to cut the UBI a little bit, and then people would have to basically work more, and then that's how you regulate it. But it wouldn't necessarily be to say, we shouldn't do it. This is unreasonable proposal in the first place. No, I don't believe that. And also, the argument that there's scarcity in our economy, I think I think it's an ideological statement. It's not necessarily reflected in what's actually happening in the economy, because our economy is still one of abundance. Sure, we have certain shortages in certain sectors, and they do crop up from time to time. When the pandemic first started, everybody was looking for masks. Like, oh my God, there's no masks, Well, now nobody says that. Nobody says there's a mask shortage. The markets did react to it. Okay. Now our current shortage is energy, so we don't, we don't have enough oil and gas, essentially. And then, of course, and then there's this ethical issue of like, okay, you're then having to pump more oil and gas, while at the same time at COP26 you were saying that you're going to reduce the fossil fuel consumption, right? but then so Joe Biden, he was actually asked about that specifically, and he said, "Yeah, that's right, but we can't do it overnight. You know, we can't do energy transition overnight because I mean, because short term, I mean, as long as you have gas-driven cars, well, you got to freaking pump the gas. You know, if you know, you have a gas stove, natural gas. Yeah, you need the gas. If we figured out a way how to transition to different energy sources, yeah, sure, let's cut it.
It's not like there aren't any technologies involving less gas and more electricity to heat up a stove. It's also made harder by certain interest groups with a big pocket that are profiting off of fossil fuel.
Yeah, I mean, the oil companies, I mean, they surely, but it's very interesting. I think there is a shift now, even in fossil fuel companies, where they're saying, okay, maybe let's not apply for new oil permits. Let's be big investors in solar panels and stuff like that. And I think, I mean, some of it might be greenwashing, where it's like, green propaganda, where they just want to look good in front of consumers. But I think some of it is also the anticipation of those oil companies that as the anti-carbon regime is intensifying, just like, for instance, the Austrian government now introduced carbon pricing, first time in history. So they know that there's a shift. It's like, okay, well, let me anticipate that shift.
Yeah, but there's only so much they can do. They cannot if you need big societal changes, like transitioning from individual cars to trains or mass transportation, they're not going to do that. Like the one, what's his face, the Tesla guy. He suggested this guy. He suggested a tunnel. He said he revolutionized transportation, basically building a tunnel for electric cars. And then transporting like 5 people at once. Instead of mass transportation, instead of a metro line, a train, transporting like 500 people at once. And he claims he revolutionized transportation.
Yeah, well,
on this transition, on this change.
No, I mean, you have to see like how much money this guy has. I mean, it's like $300 billion is the latest number, and he said that he was going to sell, 10% of his stock, which would be, well, it would be $30 billion, I guess. But if you have this much money, and then it's like you can make that much money if you do mass public transportation, right?
Yeah, it's crazy. You can make more money out of 500 people than 5 people. It's crazy.
No, but the 500 people, I mean, they only paying marginal cost, right? Like if I take the bus and it costs me $275, right, to get to Trenton. I could also take an Uber, so that's a taxi. It would be about $20. So there would be, but there would be no, bus stops. Obviously, you wouldn't be picking up people along the way. But so if I pay the taxi, it'd be much more money. I get to the destination faster for sure, but it costs more money because in the bus, it's not just me that's paying the bus driver salary and the gas, right? Yeah, there's other passengers too who are paying the cost of the public transit.
The overarching problem for this is why he suggested this ridiculous plan is because of gridlocks, because too many people need to be moved. I mean, of course he made he's gonna make the most buck if he sells if he just creates one more line for more people, for this much more people to buy his cars. Yeah, he's gonna make money, but it doesn't solve the problem of mass transportation.
Well, because he's not interested in mass public
Also,
transit.
you're 254 for bus rides because your bus is subsidized by the state.
Well, that would also be part of it, sure. But I mean, I'm not sure what the revenue model is of the public transportation system. But I would say at least half of it should be covered by the riders. And
it should be relatively profitable. At least here in Austria, here in Vienna, the public transportation is very frequent. Covers a lot of places, and it's also quite comfortable and quick. And I think they're still profitable.
Profitable in the sense that the riders are covering the cost.
Yeah, I mean, how many? I don't know the numbers, but a yearly ticket and costs €1 per day.
Yeah, I mean it's still a good model because I mean even there, I mean like you're not going to be traveling every day. I mean even if you're like Monday to Friday worker, I mean maybe Saturday, Sunday, you don't want to go anywhere, you just want to stay home, whatever. So but I guess the point being that like there's going to be enough people that pay in, and then you can spread the cost across many people and still be profitable, as you said. Versus, I mean, if you buy like a single car, you have to, who bought the car, I mean, you pay the entire cost essentially. So that's why you buy a new car, it's $25,000. And then you're buying the insurance, and then you're buying the gas. And so planet more friendly way, and also pocketbook more friendly way to travel is through the public transportation system. Now, okay, so but then there's another element that we forget here, which is that I mean you can only have a shift towards mass public transportation if people actually live in the urban areas. I mean, in most developed countries, I mean, let's say we have an urbanization rate of, say, 60, 70%. And, even if most of the urban residents are taking the public transit route, if those 30% that's living in the countryside, of course, they stay there, so which means that they could keep the cars, right? Because it's the only way to get around. The carbon record is still not going to be good. So I don't know. I mean, there's going to be this issue where we're going to have to drive up urbanization. If we want, if we're really serious about public transportation. I mean, or at least suburbanization, because the commuter rails are obviously the connecting the city to the suburbs. Yeah, and then we can talk about grand transition to its public transit. I think in the abstract, I mean, like you cannot go to a rural resident and say, hey, public transit is good enough for you, because I mean, no one is going to build a line of whatever bus route to some remote location.
Yeah, but it has to be provided.
No, but yeah, well, but if you don't have the population density,
just once a day, but there needs to be some connection.
Yeah, but I mean, it's not economic, because so you're going to pay a bus driver to drive like 3 people.
You can have like a small bus. What do you call them? Yeah, minibus. Why not? I'm talking about the coverage here in Vienna, the public transportation coverage. Actually, because we're still an old country, we don't have much of convenience stores at night, so there's not much life, except for some hotspots. There's basically no life at nighttime. So public transportation, trams, also not running at night, but there's still coverage. There's still those night buses, and even for night buses have a different route than the public transport than trams at daytime. So they don't cover everything, but those parts that are not covered by the night lines, you can call a taxi, like a public transportation taxi. It's free of charge if you have the annual card, transportation pass, and they're gonna pick you up and to drop you on the next stop, nightlight stop. That's pretty convenient. There needs to be coverage for every people. It doesn't matter how remote they are.
Yeah, but okay, so your example is still confined to Vienna, right? So
yeah,
right. You'd be living in the city.
Yeah,
I mean, that's not
live
fine to
in
me.
a countryside, in a village, like in the mountains. There's still some rails leading up to these remote areas. I've seen those trains. It's just one segment of a train, and it's running on diesel, and once a day they're running up the mountain. Yeah, and pick people up there and drop in the next city.
Yeah, I don't know. It's like there's a trade-off that needs to be made with anything. I mean, I noticed that there are some people who really like the rural life. I mean, obviously, as both of us grew up in a big city, but I have to say that I actually like village life. You have a small town here; it's about 30,000 people. Very low population density. And what's great about it is that, when I go jogging, the people that I wink at, they wink back. Like that's how you know that, that the area is not overflowing with people. Because if you have too many people, you go to New York City, Philadelphia, Vienna, whatever, any big city, and you want to avoid people that you meet in public, because I mean, you basically feel like an ant, and then you're basically bumping your shoulders with other ants in this big colony.
Ants don't work that way. Ants are actually very social. Using their social pheromones to communicate.
Yeah, I mean, but see, in a small town, I mean, I get the sense like, okay, like I'm not going to talk with most of the people that I meet here, but even just a wink, it's like, it's just acknowledge, we are, I don't know, fellow humans on the planet. That's all it is. Like a simple gesture. And I for some reason I find it to be, this is very appealing. I mean, just that little gesture is very appealing about living in a small town. Now I have a lot of colleagues of mine here. I mean, they're not living in Princeton. I mean, they're going to New York, they're going to Philadelphia because they wanted to live, close to a Broadway show and theater and movie and restaurants and whatever the amazing life that you can get in the city, which you don't get here, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, like if you're like a low stimulation guy, you don't need a nightlife really. You're just happy with. I mean, there's probably 3 bars, and that's probably the main the core of the nightlife in this town. I don't know. I mean, it seems to be enough. They don't need much more stimulation. Yeah.
I'm getting a little confused here. Well, first you talk about we need the urbanization. We need to drive up the urbanization rate. Now you're talking about the.
No, I'm talking about the reasons why the small towns are attractive. I mean, I'm not saying that small towns is good for the purposes of climate change and public transit. I mean, these are arguments at different levels. I mean,
you can mitigate the impact of public transportation gridlocks from rural pendler
commuters.
Yeah, by the advent of home office.
Yeah, so that's what happened with the pandemic. So we said that it's okay to be, doing home office, and there's discussions now about, whether employers should make it permanent. And whether or not they make it permanent, it really depends because this is like the thing is like a social norm, right? Like if X% of employers say you have to stay home, or you can stay home as long as you want, and then there's another amount of employers who say no, you have to come back. I mean, we have to see. I mean, if the second group is growing, then and the first group is getting less, then I think we're going to go back to normal again, to the pre-pandemic. But or what could also happen is like those two groups, I mean, they stabilize at some value, then we have a long-term shift in terms of work norms that's happening. What the actual trend is, I mean, I'm not sure at this point, but it's definitely become much more common to do home office for sure. The studies, I think, indicate that there's a gradation or distinction that you can make between introvert and extrovert types. So if you're more of an introverted kind of worker, we're basically like, yeah, you know, basically your goal is to minimize distractions, and distractions are usually other people. Well, if that's your goal, then actually home office is much better. Now, but then there's other people who say, no, 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 actually, you know, I want to have the social aspect. You know, the benefit of being at this workplace is precisely that I get to meet people.
Yeah, not just to meet people, but to get work done. Because if you're not really familiar with that kind of system, you need to ask your colleagues. You can just knock on the door. So just go over to the desk and ask something and get an answer right away instead of zooming.
Right, because in the Zoom you have to actually schedule it in advance.
Yeah.
And then it's yeah. So oftentimes, yeah, if you have like small questions, you know, it's like, oh, it doesn't make any sense. Well, when you for small things, you probably use Slack, you know, or use email service, some chat service. Um, but then sometimes it's like it's very hard to explain yourself in writing, you know, and then well then yeah then a phone call maybe Zoom call or something might be the way out. Um, but I mean, but that's more theoretical to you because you know, you enjoy the leisure. You enjoy the leisurely environment much more.
Yeah,
And
I'll do.
but I mean, and
This time of my life.
and I mean, and well, I mean, you're framing it as this is the worst thing in the world, but in fact, I think I almost think like it's a dream world. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think everybody's sort of like, well, I
Just
don't know.
as long as it lasts.
I very much like the idea of you know, of early retirement, and making stock investments and things like that.
It's not everybody's game. I mean, recently I'm seeing more and more commercials on YouTube or advertisements for. I'd say that I'd say like 80-90% of them are scam artists. Like, you want money? Look at me. Look at my lifestyle. You want that? Huh? Then sign up. I hate that.
Yeah, that sounds like bullshit to me. But in terms of like money philosophy, I mean, there's one book that I would recommend to people, which is Jack Bogle. He's a founder of Vanguard, and he sort of writes about the wisdom of index funds. Um, because for index funds, there's a track record. I mean, it's not speculation. It's you base it on the historical steps record, track record, which is 8 to 10% per year growth. I mean, and I mean, if that's what the trend is, I mean, okay, now I read recently in even in Vanguard they were saying, hey, it's not going to be 9-10%, it's going to be 4%, in the future. And then they have like different reasons to speculate this way, like I don't know, stagnation in emerging markets and aging population, whatever, but the historical record is 10%. So I'm like, that sounds good to me, because you have to notice like it's 10% at every level of income. I mean, this is what's so crazy about compound interest. Right? So you're taking 10% out of 10,000. Okay, well, it's $1,000. You're taking 10% out of 100 billion. That's 10 billion. I mean, that's why like if you get to the stage of like Jeff Bezos or Musk or Zuckerberg, that's why it grows so quickly for them. Because I mean, because well, okay, they own stocks with their own companies, and of course, their own company stock goes like crazy. But even let's say if these guys sold their own stock and they only purchased index stocks, out of which, by the way, more than 50% of the S&P 500 is covered by the big five companies, right? Which are called FANG: Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Google, and something else. I don't know. Well, Tesla might be top 6 or something, but it's a but a huge part of the total stock valuation is now covered just by the big technology companies. Yeah, but if you own, yeah, even just the S&P 500, they'd still be getting 10%. I mean, they'll be getting less than what they currently do with their, because their own stocks is doing much better than S&P. But they'd still be doing very well, because it's a 10%, it's compounding and it keeps growing bigger. Because the percentage rise isn't declining, right? That's very strange, right? If you look at the last year S&P 500, it was like 40%. This year might also be on track for that. I don't know. I mean, it seems like, I mean, I started investments in June this year, and it's up 10%. Now, there was a down phase between September and October. Basically, all the gains were wiped out, and then November it's coming back up again. But so it's fluctuating, but it fluctuates upwards. And yeah, so I think anybody should invest in the index fund if they have the savings available. It's like, is there a downside risk? Yeah, there's one downside risk, which is when the entire market crashes. But like, if you have, like, let's say if you have single companies that's going under, that doesn't matter. These single companies, I mean, what happens is that they get cut out of the S&P 500, and then you basically add the next more profitable company back into the 500. So there's only like an entire market risk. There's no single company risk whatsoever. And so that means you also don't really have to study companies. Like, who's this guy? Warren Buffett. I mean, a big part of his strategy. Well, I mean, there's two parts of his strategy. I mean, the one is being a holding company, which means just own everything. And then the second strategy is stock picking. It's like, just understand the kind of stocks it's going to do well, and then buy those. Yeah, I mean, yeah, if you have good instincts, if you have the time to do research, yeah, you should do that. If you don't want to do any of that, just buy the index fund. I think it's a good, yeah, I think it's a good way to to invest. Now, I mean, but then I also know people who are saying, like environmentalists who are like, oh my God, why should I invest in fossil fuel companies, for instance? I would make myself guilty of the climate disaster and whatever else.
The vegetarians among investors.
Yeah, I mean, there's like ideological points that you can make about it, and obviously, if you really do care about it, then yeah, I think then you should be careful in your investing, and then then don't buy the index fund, just buy specific stocks, whatever. But if you're sort of like agnostic about it, or if you're saying, well, I can still sleep on it, I mean, I also see like investing as a way to, subsidize, my intellectual existence, right? Um, by participating in the greedy capitalistic economy. Of course, up until the point at which the markets really do crash. Because we also have to say, like, that the possibility of a market crash is actually growing every day. Because I mean, because we had this big financial crisis in 2008, and that could have been really bad in terms of employment, in terms of well-being of the population, savings, everything. And then the governments in the world, they sort of came in and they said, hey, the central banks in the world, are just going to give you cash to the banks. It's like, how much cash do you need? Oh, how much cash can we get, say the banks, and then the governments say, as much as you need. And that game, I mean, and then there was a little bit of tapering, which means the government central bank purchases fewer bonds. And then, of course, COVID-19 happened. And the government printed even more money than they did in 2008. So it's very interesting where it's like you can have entire economies that's declining, right? To 2020 was a bad year for the economy, but it was the best year for the stock market on record. And you're like, well, what's the connection right there, right? Because isn't there a link between the real economy, jobs, companies, investments, on the one hand, and the stock market on the other? And it was like, why is it that the stock market can be divorced from the real economy? And I mean, the answer is basically the central bank. Basically, I mean, they just say, hey, here's some money. I'll give you some money, and the companies say thank you, and then the companies with the extra cash all of a sudden buy their own shares back, and then that drives up the share prices. And as you have the share prices go up, then you have the investors who are coming to buy more shares of that company. and it's regardless of how many people lose their jobs. It's like whatever, it doesn't matter. So how long can you continue this game? It's like, I mean, the real answer is like we don't know. I mean, nobody knows. I mean, it's like I would like to see an economist who can give a good guess of it, but I don't think so. You're basically just doing the QE, and then you hope that will continue like that.
Not that people have the priority straight, huh? The government.
Yeah, well, I mean, you see the government officials, the economists, whatever. I mean, they don't know what they're doing either, right? It's like you see the complicated thing in our society is that oftentimes like experts don't know really what they're doing and whether what they're doing is the right thing. It's just that we discovered this tool. It's a tool to solve one problem, which is liquidity crunch, right? Not enough liquidity in the system to pay off debts. So we solved that problem by doing QE. And then the after effects, we haven't figured out how to solve that. Like a potential future economic crash or something like that. Even with COVID, I mean, like, did the experts know what the best public health measure was? No. And I mean, but even today, it's like 2 years into the pandemic, and in the European countries, I mean, where the cases are high, they're debating a lockdown again. It's like the same measure that they put in place beginning of last year, right? Which suggests that the people in charge, they don't know what they're doing. I mean, but it's like, I mean, the common people, I mean, we also don't know, right? I mean, it's just it's like what we are facing is a risk society. It's a society with more and more inbuilt risks. The risk of a financial crash, the risk of cyber hacking, the risk of a pandemic, the risk of climate change. I mean, is there a way out of it? Well, not really. I mean, I mean, it's living a more simple lifestyle, I think, would probably be the way out of it.
Yeah, if a human can't solve these problems, if the experts don't know what they're doing, who knows? Who can do it? What do you think of AI government?
I don't think that AI government is a good idea, but it's going to happen anyway. Because the temptation for it is going to be great.
I mean, it's slow, right? There's always a transition phase. Where do you use AI? For mundane business, for repetitive business, government business, for things you don't really need. That's a that's easy to automize. When once you implemented that, where do we go from there? Because at the beginning, you still want decision making to be reserved for actual politicians. But once the AI gathers enough information, gets a feel of how things work, they can work out algorithms and adapt to arising situations, and at some point take over the entire government.
Yeah, so there was this discussion with a guy named Jocko Willing. He's a former Navy SEAL, and he was discussing the use of autonomous weapons systems. And he's a soldier, so he has a very simple way of thinking about it, and which is, he says, does a human have the ability to override? Which is to say, so AI makes a decision, okay, this is a terroristic target, we're going to throw a bomb over them. And then the question is like, well, is there still one person at least who looks at that decision and then could say, we can stop it, we override it? And if the answer is yes, then he says that autonomous weapon systems are okay, no problem. And
it's just a issue. You mean there just needs to be a lawful person to take responsibility for the actions.
Ultimately, that's where it goes back to. Yeah, I would say yes.
It's not like the decision making is any better than AI judgment. I would actually say that AI judgment depends on how much data you fed.
Well, the AI is going to give a judgment, but then the final judgment, that's the key, right? Who has the final judgment? So it's like, if you said you let AI, they run the model, right? And then they spit out a decision. And then you submit that decision to a human person, essentially. And so what's oftentimes going to happen is that the human is very likely going to defer to AI. That's, of course, assuming that the AI made the right choice.
Yeah, because especially in combat, there needs to be split-second decisions to be made, and if you're just waiting for a human to approve an AI decision, you're gonna waste time. You're gonna have to recalculate. Shooting a very, very fast missile, like more than 5 times.
I mean, it's like, okay, all right, okay. So you're saying there's a trade-off between, speed and effectiveness, and I mean, if that's the case, I would say, yeah, I think that effectiveness actually probably is more important. I mean, even if you're sacrificing somewhat on the speed, yeah, there's a lot of complicated calculations that we have to make with respect to AI ethics, because another example, I have one of my colleagues, she teaches in Notre Dame now, and but she was studying AI judgment in courts, what's called cash bail. So cash bail is a concept that you get picked up by the police, you get put in detention, and then if you post bail, so the judge allows you to post bail, which means you pay money to the court basically, and then you can go free until the trial happens, right? So it's called pre. And if you don't get bail, then you are under pre-trial detention. So you're basically held in the prison until the trial happens. Okay, now so what they're doing now is to add AI into making the decision on cash bail, right? And the finding is that basically that the AI makes certain glitches because, I mean, it's essentially it all boils down to discrimination, right? Because AI can only make decisions based on past data, the past record. Then the past record of, let's say, a person who was getting, imprisoned, is based on, let's say, racist cops, right? I mean, it could be people, it could be the cops that say, oh, we single you out, you look unsympathetic to me, with your clothing or whatever else, your persona, your appearance, your race. And that behavior of the cop then feeds a lot of information into the AI system. Now, of course, AIs wouldn't be able to discern that, this kind of underlying patterns of discrimination. They just see, oh, this is the past data. Okay, this guy looks like he's going to commit the crime again, so we're going to deny the bail application. Yeah, there was another research paper about AI hiring algorithms, right? So nowadays, when you apply for a job, you submit your resume online, but you don't have people that sift through the application in the first run. In the first run, you have this, AI screening essentially. And you see, the problem with AI screening is basically that AI screening basically looks for keywords. If you have the keyword included in the resume, then that's like the first cut. Now, I mean, suppose you don't know what the keywords are for that company. It's like, oh shit. Then, then you might have exactly the qualifications for the job, but you cannot make it past the AI screening. Well, another problem has to do with gender discrimination, right? So if AI discovers that, let's say it's a tech job application, engineering, which is, it's a male-dominated field, I would say more than 80% is still male, then actually a female applicant is disadvantaged. Now, if you have like, affirmative action programs, if you have like human, you sort of built it in. It's like, okay, all right, we're going to hire X amount of women, Y amount of minorities, etc. Yeah, then maybe you can override that. But the inclination of the AI using past data is to say that perhaps the female applicant is worth less. That is to say, is going to be less likely to pass the screening. So, I mean, I guess the point being that that AI is not without fault. Now, would anybody say we shouldn't be using it? I don't think that anybody would go this far. But certainly, I mean, the simple narrative of, you know, it's always good is maybe not the right way of looking at it.
I mean, I agree. The greatest fault with AI, the greatest shortcoming is the lack of flexible thinking, like humans do. But again, with uh, other inventions, it's gonna take a while until uh, it's it's gonna get fit enough to actually use it. It's gonna get late now, huh?
Okay, all right. Then we'll wrap it up for this podcast. I thank my guest here, and to my audience. Hopefully, see you next time.
All right. Goodbye, folks.